So welcome to the 2014-2015 Lectures in Catholic Experience. My name is Christina Vanine. I'm Associate Dean here at St. Jerome's University, and I'm coordinating this year's lecture series. Please, before we begin, would you check your pockets and bags and purses and turn off any electronic devices that you might have with you. Disconnect or power down, as some people say. Great. Thank you. Given that world leaders are gathering today in Peru for the start of the UN Lima Climate Change Conference, it's especially compelling that we come here tonight for this Ignatian lecture on ecology and justice. Since the beginning of his pontificate, Pope Francis has consistently spoken of the exploitation of the earth as one of the greatest challenges of our time, a challenge that is theological as well as political, a challenge that calls for human transformation or conversion. This challenge is significant enough that Pope Francis is preparing to issue an encyclical on this topic in 2015. It's important to situate what Pope Francis has been saying within the context of what the International Society of Jesus said in Decree 3 of its 35th General Congregation. In this decree on mission, the Jesuits talk about being called to establish right relationships, to be globally engaged in the work of reconciliation with God, with one another, and with creation. The Jesuits in English Canada, in turn, have taken seriously this invitation to show ever more effective ecological solidarity in our spiritual, communal, and apostolic lives, which is how the decree talks about it. We are privileged here in our region to have one of the premier Jesuit centers for ecological solidarity just down the highway in Guelph, the Ignatius Jesuit Center. And we are pleased this evening to have the chair of the board of directors, Barbara Peloso, with us this evening. Since the 1990s, Ignatius Jesuit Center has intentionally sought to integrate ecology, justice, and spirituality in all aspects of its work, including the way it trains people to be spiritual directors, in the retreats it offers, and including retreats that are specifically focused on reconciliation with the earth, on its community shared agriculture program, its community gardens program, its old growth forest initiative, and the building of a set of stations of the cosmos. Given this critical Jesuit commitment to ecology and justice, we are very fortunate to have with us this evening Dr. Bruce Alexander, Professor Emeritus from the Department of Psychology, Simon Fraser University, British Columbia. Dr. Alexander received his BA from Miami University in Ohio, and then his MS and PhD degrees from the University of Wisconsin. During his distinguished career at Simon Fraser University, he focused much of his teaching and research on the psychology of addiction. But he says in the introduction to his 2008 book, The Globalization of Addiction, a study in poverty of the spirit, he talks about the fact that a few years ago, he decided to shift his attention toward cultivating his interest in history. And this led him to focus his teaching on the history of psychology for a number of years. And that shift has led to the publication of his most recent book, A History of Psychology in Western Civilization, published in 2014 by Cambridge University Press and written with Curtis Shelton. What is important for tonight's Ignatian lecture is that this shift to the history of addiction and the history of psychology has provided Dr. Alexander with significantly new and critical insights into addiction. Insights that can help us better understand what it is about our human nature that makes it so difficult for us to do what we know we should do or what we determine to be the right thing to do. Why is it that we have so much information about an environmental problem like climate change, and yet we continue to proceed along the same economic or political paths? How are we to understand this dimension of our human condition? And how can we find our way through it? Well, we are fortunate to have Dr. Alexander with us, who has been thinking quite deeply about such questions and is with us to share that thinking this evening. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Alexander to speak to us on the topic, "For the Sake of the Earth, Let's Deal with Our Collective Malaise." Dr. Alexander.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you all. May I say I am honored to be here, to be speaking at the Ignatian Lecture. I'm honored to be invited by the Society of Jesuits, people of such bravery and such big thinking. And I am humbled at the same time to be talking about environmental issues. I'm humbled by the activists who are so much braver than I am, who have done so much more. And I'm sure some of you are probably here in the audience who've done so much more. When I left Vancouver, the day I left on the train, the students at my university were being arrested on Burnaby Mountain for protesting a pipeline that was coming through our campus. And, well, my wife Pat and I rode across the prairies in the sumptuous comfort of Via Rail. They continued being arrested. So I'm humbled by the activists, and I sort of, if I could, I would invoke their spirit into what I want to say here. I've tried to narrow down the topic a little bit because it's too big. And so I'll try to put the focus this way, on the environmental crisis and the flood of addiction. The environmental crisis, I don't need to say anything about. Anything I would say about it is, I'm sure, redundant. It's happening. It's here. It's now. And we all know, I think we all struggle with the fact that something must be done. We know something must be done because we face probable catastrophe, and we don't know exactly what it is that should be done, but we know it must be, and we know it must be soon. The leaders in dealing with the environmental crisis, one has to say, have been the scientists, have been the ecologists and the climate scientists. But not just those scientists, but also the evolutionary scientists and the cosmological physicists, if you will, the scientists who are making us see the world in a bigger and more extraordinary way than we've been able to comprehend it previously. And the leaders in environmentalists are the people of religion, including, as Christina has mentioned, the Jesuits themselves, and Pope Francis, and Thomas Berry, and James Prophet, and Thich Nhat Hanh, and Starbuck. People from all kinds of, Starhawk, I mean. Starhawk. Yes. Well, but they're all spiritual people. That's the point, and they are taking the lead in a way that I don't imagine could have been predicted. They're taking the lead because they're saying, look, this environmental crisis is really a spiritual crisis. It's not going to be solved unless we form some kind of a spiritual awakening that will be big enough and powerful enough and passionate enough that we will bring it under control. And the religious thinkers remind us that this has happened over and over again in history. The example which I'll focus on tonight is the ending of slavery in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The most amazing story of people rising up, primarily in England at first, but then later in France and the United States, people rising up against an institution that seemed absolutely impregnable, the institution of slavery, which had always existed and was unquestioned. It was one of the major economic pillars of the economy of the British Empire. It was unquestioned, and yet, starting with a small number of religious people, primarily Quakers in this case, the energy was gathered in a short time, in the course of really only a century, was long enough to outlaw slavery in the British Empire, eventually to end it in the United States, to essentially rid the world of black slavery. Now, we all know that slavery continues in some forms now, but the point is that religious historians are showing us that faith can move mountains, can and does and has, and therefore we cannot despair. Now, I wish I could say that the psychologists have also been leaders in dealing with the environmental crisis, but I can't exactly say that. No, psychologists have not been leaders, and yet it does fall to us in some way. Psychology, I think, has a very important role. If you think about apathy, for example, it's clear, religious history is enough to make it clear that very, very powerful institutions can be overturned, as in the case of slavery. Very powerful institutions can be overturned. But the belief that they cannot be overturned, which we call apathy, could still defeat us. In other words, the potential for overturning the institutions is there, but the apathy must be overturned first, and it's really the apathy, therefore, that's the problem. So, inasmuch as religious people can say the problem is a spiritual problem, for tonight I want to present it to you as a psychological problem. And I want to say, how do we deal with the psychological aspects of it? And I wish I was going to give you a very short answer, but I'm not. I do think there is an answer. I have come through my exploration of this. We'll now see. We're hoping that something will happen. I pressed the wrong button. Ever got back to there? No. Yes. Okay, there we are. I think we can say, if we look at science and theology and psychology, I think we can say all the potential is there that we need. All the potential for coming together in a way that will now enable us not only to comprehend this problem, but to see clearly our own roles in doing something about it. I think that can be shown, and that's what I hope to show. And I have this pursuing this topic, which is new, as Christina has pointed out. This is a new topic for me. Pursuing this topic has become a matter of joy for me because I do feel that we can overcome this topic. I do feel all the potential is there, and therefore I feel very happy on days like today when I'm in the presence of a number of people who seriously care about this issue. And there's room for joy in this. And I feel very, very the same kind of feeling when I think about those students out there on Burnaby Mountain. Here are what I like to call 6 grim psychological realities, and I won't take up too much time with these because you all know this already. I just want to lay them out in a fairly systematic way. Why is it that we haven't yet brought the environmental problem under control? Well, if we look at it as a psychologist does, there are these 6 realities to deal with. The first is a flood of severe addictions. That is, people are really addicted to money, food, consumer goods, fashions, all kinds of stuff. And now I'm talking about shopaholics or hoarders or people who, I'm talking about addiction in a very obvious sense. This is a serious problem. People are consuming this stuff at enormous rates. And number 2, severe power and wealth addictions. That is to say, there is a stereotype of the CEO the CEO of a multinational corporation as a person who is so relentless and ruthless in pursuit of money and power that they destroy the terrain and they destroy the people who are on the terrain. Well, that stereotype is true. Such people do exist, and there's a well-documented literature, not just the literature of economics, but the literature of psychology. There's a well-documented literature on the fact that many of these people are simply addicted. That's the right word for it. They're addicted to wealth and power. The leading guy on this is Philip Slater in his book Wealth Addiction, but there's a vast literature on this. This is not to say that every CEO in the world is an addicted person, but it is to say that there is this problem, which is very clearly an addictive problem. And what do these CEOs do? These executives, they aren't all CEOs, of course. What do? Well, they slice and dice the earth into little packages for the addicted consumers to devour. And this, of course, is a huge problem, and it's an addiction problem. Addiction problems are not easy to overcome. Everyday excess. Well, everyday excess means that probably most people are not shopaholics or hoarders or enormous consumers, but an awful lot of us consume too much, and we know it, and it's we struggle with our diets and with our credit cards and with all these things because these are relatively minor excesses, we could say, but you multiply these minor excesses by millions or hundreds of millions of practitioners, and you've got an environmental problem. And again, these are very difficult to deal with, these kinds of excessive consumptions. And then there's the problem of debilitating recovery. That is, now this is a problem which is well known in my field, that lots of people are recovering from addiction or who are recovering from all kinds of things, from traumas, from anxiety attacks, from all kinds of problems. And some of these people who are recovering are restored to the world in the sense that they become active members of the community and often play a major role in, for example, the environmental movement. But other people who are recovering are just recovering. There's a phrase which is used commonly, and it's an accurate phrase. There are many people who are addicted to recovery, and they are not doing much more in their recovery than they were doing in their addiction, and that too is a problem if you consider the loss of people who might be actively involved in changing the world and the kind of spiritual conversion that Christina has talked about. Well, they're not there. And apathy, denial, half-hearted resolve. Well, I guess I won't belabor this. We all know what apathy looks like. We all know what denial looks like. And it's a big problem, really big, because it can be bigger than the denial can be bigger than the thing which is being denied. And finally, misplaced missionary zeal. I bet you have met people who are missionaries for the cause of climate change denial. People who really want to spend your time teaching you that there is no climate change going on, or that if there is climate change going on, it's not man-made. There are lots of people with that kind of missionary approach to it, and they're a problem. And of course, they are encouraged by media like Fox News and so forth. But these are all psychological components, I think, of the problem. Now, my thesis for the evening is that we can understand these familiar psychological problems quite a bit better if we look carefully at the psychology of addiction, and that's what I want to do. That's my proposition to you for the evening. And I hope you will understand that when I say that, I'm not talking about people with these kinds of problems as if they all had a chronic brain disease of drug or alcohol use. That's not what I mean by addiction. I mean, I'm using addiction in the normal English sense of the word. Addiction is an involvement which is so big that it takes the guts out of a person's existence. It narrows them down and puts them into a box that eliminates all the other important things they might be doing. That is the normal English sense of the word addiction, and that's the way I will use the word. Now here, there's an elephant in the room, and the elephant is that there is a conception now afoot that addiction must be understood as a brain disease that has to do with alcohol and drug consumption, and this conception is highly funded ultimately by the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the United States, but by many other professional organizations and many government organizations. I'm going to ignore that view of addiction completely. If you would want to read some of my other work, you would see that I, along with many contemporary psychologists and other kinds of researchers, are actively opposing that point of view, but I'm not going to actively oppose it tonight. I'm just going to ignore it. I'm going to say it's not important enough in this context to worry about, because I want to talk about addiction in the way that it has been understood throughout our history, and I'll give you some examples of that. But there's another little sort of caution here, and that is, I don't want you to understand me as saying that addiction is the only way of understanding these psychological problems or the environmental problem. I do not mean to say that all evil comes from addiction. I don't mean that. I just mean that I hope to show you that it's a very useful way of approaching this particular set of problems, among other useful ways. And that if we are to deal with this set of problems, and we're going to have to deal with it in many ways, but this is my submission for the night. So what about addiction? What is that? Well, I don't know how many of you read The Republic. Maybe many in this context, but yeah, Plato talks about addiction, only he of course doesn't use the Latin word addiction. He uses Greek words which are translated as master passion into English. I don't even know what the Greek words are, but they're consistently translated into master passion. Here's what Plato says. He says that when a democracy has gone corrupt and is declining, it's going to decline into a tyranny. And he says the characteristic of a tyranny is that people become, it is an addicted society. Everybody in a tyranny latches on to something fairly trivial or banal and makes that the center of their life because they have nothing to believe in. It says when a democracy is a strong kind of an entity, people have everything to believe in. It's a going concern, and the institutions of democracy are powerful and so forth. But when a democracy has declined, there's really nothing left to believe in. People are at a loss to fulfill their need to have faith or belief on a political level now. And so what do? They become addicted. And he says that the most addicted people, the most addicted person of all, will become the leader in a tyranny. When you read the Republic on this topic, you'll find several descriptions in there of which Plato gives for a person with a master passion. And I think you'll realize, I think everybody realizes it when they look at it this way, that Plato was talking exactly about addiction in the normal way that we use the term. But look at what he's doing. He's not making it into a disease of alcohol and drug use. He's making it into a social, a social downfall, a pitfall that people fall into under certain kinds of social conditions. And he's saying not only is it a pitfall which harms people's lives, but also it changes the politics of the situation. It's a political event as well as a personal tragedy. Okay, it's in that same sense that I'm talking about addiction now. You might think about the way St. Augustine talks about addiction. In the Confessions, where he talks about his own addictions to sex and love on the one hand, and to status, social status, and in his Roman culture on the other hand. But he makes his own addictions not just to a personal tragedy. He makes it into the center of his vision of the Christian path, of the path to God. Addiction, again, it's not a little nasty little disease of drug use. It's a central fact in this central drama which he's talking about. And of course, you know that when the depraved late Roman Empire collapses, it's the Christian path that St. Augustine has defined in part in terms of overcoming addiction that lasts and guides the recovery of a new civilization in Europe. Once again, you see, addiction is not just a little disease problem. Addiction has major roles in these epic dramas of civilization, and I think it has a major role in the one which we're facing right now. So let me talk about addiction in this way, in this historical way. I want to give you a historical picture of addiction. I'm now going to press this button, and nothing's going to happen. By the way, we'll skip this immediately, but this is the Oxford English Dictionary of the definition of the word addiction. You can see what it means. You'll notice that the words drug or alcohol or brain disease don't appear in that. This is the sense in which we're talking about addiction. Here's a historical view of addiction. I've put it in the form of a cycle. And in the center of the cycle is an ancient character looking worried. You might guess who that character is. It's Columbus. So this is a picture of addiction in the modern era. That is the era since Columbus, the 500-year period roughly since Columbus. What happened in that era? Again, I don't need to belabor this too much because we all know this story, or at least the first part of it. What happened is that all the social structures and institutions of the late Middle Ages broke down, right? So that the church began to weaken, the families began to weaken, all kinds of institutions began to weaken. For example, I mean, if we think of it in terms of the history of Canada, what happened? Well, Europeans came to Canada and they found here quite stable societies, native societies, Aboriginal societies, and exploited them and confined them in such a way that these societies were devastated, were totally fragmented. Of course, the English and French people, primarily who did that in Canada, were also doing it in England and France. So that at the same time we have this devastation, this fragmentation of Aboriginal society in Canada, we have a fragmentation of peasant society in England and France going on at the same time. So we have the clearances of the commons, whereby large numbers of people are driven off the land in England and ultimately driven into the city and making the pool of very poor people that was necessary for the Industrial Revolution. But this comes at the cost of fragmenting all the institutions and traditions of life that previously existed. And this is a picture not just of Columbus's time or those centuries, but this is a picture of our own time as well. The fragmentation of society is a characteristic of all of modernity. It's going on today, perhaps as much as it ever was. So again, what do we know in Canada? Where do we see this? Well, we see this in, for example, pipelines. We have in British Columbia pipelines coming not only through my campus, but across the north through all kinds of wonderful and pristine territory. We have fracking, which is going on and destroying the aquifers in the north. And we have all the institutions of modernity really collaborating in this fragmentation. For example, in Vancouver, we see it very much in terms of the real estate market. We have a real estate market which is just not an orderly market whereby we can pass on our houses to our children, but we have a real estate market which is enormously volatile because of the interests of developers and offshore investors, all of which the market caters to, and the market becomes a wild thing. And the people who would normally benefit from a slowly evolving normal market can't do it. It's fragmented. So here we have, in a sense, you could say the institutions of the modern economy destroy themselves. The market destroys itself. It becomes a crazy market. And I think you have perhaps some kinds of real estate problems like that in Ontario as well. Well, what does fragmentation do? Fragmentation is a social term. It refers to what happens to a society. But the inevitable effect of fragmentation, of course, is a psychological one, that people become dislocated, so that the people who were formerly embedded in the coherent set of institutions of their culture are now at loose. They're at loose ends and not connected to anything really. So that we have people who are rootless and meaningless and identityless and purposeless and who don't belong anywhere. This is dislocation. I use that term. Other people prefer the term alienation. Marx preferred to call it alienation, and Thomas Berry also prefers to call it alienation. It doesn't matter what you call it. The fact is that there's a psychological event which is characteristic of modernity, which is very profound. I mean, to cut a person off from all the ties which normally unite us to other people and other structures is radical surgery. So radical that if you think about it in terms of punishments, what do you do if you want to punish someone short of killing them? Historically, what do? Well, you banish them. That is, you dislocate them, or you exile them, or you put them in solitary confinement, or you send them to Coventry, or you dislocate them. Dislocation is a very, very serious event, and it's a characteristic event of modernity, something that, as far as we know, increases all the time. And dislocation, of course, is now an absolutely essential component in modern torture. Why, when you see the pictures of these guys who are in Guantanamo or wherever they are being tormented, they have hoods on. Why are the hoods? The hoods are so they don't see other people. It's everything is done to dislocate them. Dislocation is terrible. What do dislocated people do? Well, they tend to go into despair and depression and anxiety, apathy, and if they can, they become addicted. Addiction it functions as a way of coping with dislocation. And this idea, if it's new to you, may be a little bit hard to swallow right at first. And I think about it always in terms of my own background in Vancouver. I make downtown east side metaphors, but what if a person in Vancouver has really nothing going in their lives? What do? Well, they go to the downtown east side and they pull out $20 and they buy some white powder. And what are they buying with that white powder? Well, they can stick it in their arm and it'll soothe them. It's a good anesthetic, good tranquilizer. But it also buys them membership. All of a sudden, they're not just a nobody with nowhere to go. What are they? They're a junkie. And one of the great discoveries of recent years is that to be a part of the junkie mentality, the junkie community, is not to be nothing. It's to be, it's to have a membership. It's to have a belonging. Well, I don't have time for lots of examples, but addictions work that way, and you can provide example after example. I mean, any number of examples. Addictions work adaptively. This is part of the reason why we can't understand them if we just think they're a kind of a reflexive response to a drug. They're purposeful, and the main way that we know this is actually by spending a lot of time with addicted people, which I do. So now we have addictions, and we're not talking about drug addictions primarily, although I've used that as my example for convenience. We're just talking about all these kinds of addictions to money, sex, gambling, internet, social networking, on and on and on. This list goes on forever. What's the consequence of this flood of addictions? Well, the consequence is that we have some people who are who get by. They might otherwise kill themselves. They might otherwise just sink into a terminal kind of depression and despair. Well, they kind of keep going, and in a way, it serves an adaptive function. It's obviously not an ideal adaptive function, but it's some kind of an adaptive function. But the other thing we have is that it produces all kinds of harm. So if a person, let's say, is addicted to money and power in a serious way and finds a way to rise through the ranks, to the head of a hedge fund or to the head of a multinational corporation, and then feeds this addiction, well, they do harm, all kinds of harm. And what if a person, what if it's a food addiction and the person is eating enormous amounts of food and well, this is increasing the burden on the environment. These addictions are really costly. And people who are addicted are unable, of course, to contribute in any serious way to the serious social issues of the day, like the environmental issue. How could they possibly? They're wrapped up. They're desperately filling an empty void as best as they can, and that's all they have time for. Therefore, the consequences of addiction increase fragmentation. The addiction actually completes the vicious cycle. And what we have here is a vicious cycle of modernity, which has been going on for a very long time. Now, I've talked about this only as a cycle of addiction, but I think you can see it's also a cycle of ecological destruction. That built into this addictive, self-perpetuating addictive cycle, we have environmental destruction. And we have at this point, I think, the way of understanding in a fairly simple graphic way, the relationship between these two things, addiction and the environmental crisis. They're closely related. It might be possible to say that they're simply both manifestations of a single kind of a social cycle, which is characteristic of our modern times. So what do we do about that? Thomas Berry, who I keep mentioning, is a author, a priest and an author who wrote The Sacred Universe. And he has come up with, I think, a very useful phrase, which I want to show you. If I can, I don't know why. Try this one. We want to go down one more. One more down. Oh, never mind that one. I can't get there. Thomas Berry. It doesn't matter. Thomas Berry, and oh, good. You're good. Stop. Please read this paragraph before it goes away. Thank you. What is most needed, I'm skipping some words, is a deep cultural therapy that will identify the sources of our pathology and provide a way of returning to the jubilant life expression that should characterize any human mode of being, he says. That is what's needing, isn't it? It's a deep cultural therapy. And the question, of course, is what would a deep cultural therapy look like? And of course, that's the question which we all ask, and perhaps in other words. But I want to take a crack at that question, what would a deep cultural therapy look like? But I understand that you will have your own answers to this question, but here are my answers. And again, I'm following Thomas Berry in various ways here. It will involve education. And that's it. We're not going to need any more. Thank you very much, David. It will involve education. I mean, Thomas Berry says, of course, if we're going to solve this problem, we have to teach our children well. We have to teach our children better. And what does that mean? Well, we all can bemoan the fact that our children are not really getting educated by us. They're getting educated by the various screens they watch. But they are getting educated by us to a certain extent. And I believe that we have to be more purposeful in the way we educate our children. For one thing, I think we have to educate our children to the kind of vision of the universe and the cosmos that will provide the spiritual basis for a upwelling of energy to deal with environmental problems. And we have to teach them about the joy of working together with other people and solving problems. That's the easy part. The hard part is I think we have to also teach the children about their role and their parents' role as problems, as part of the problem, rather than as in addition to as part of the solution. Because most of us are. I mean, I am. I'm assuming that many of you are too, part of the problem. And we have to, I think we have to teach our children that. I mean, that all the junk and junk food that we consume in our various ways are significant. These are not just happy little things that happen, but these are part of a gnawing away at the environment that we cannot sustain. And I think this means teaching the children something which is really unpleasant. When I think about this, I realize that this doesn't fit very well with my own field of psychology. We're supposed to teach children, we're supposed to bolster self-esteem on all occasions and to teach cheeriness and happiness philosophy and all this kind of stuff. I think it fits perhaps better with the history of religion. I think the fact of teaching the concept of sin is a very interesting idea to me, because, and I am, by the way, I am not a religious person, but it makes sense to me that children would understand the concept of evil and their own role in it at a very young age. Now, I do not mean returning to the bad old days of humiliating children and teaching they're awful or anything like that. But what I mean is that I think we are forced, if I understand this, we are forced to teach our children much more realistically. We are forced to teach our children more honestly than we have. I've been studying the journals of John Woolman. I don't know if you know this guy, but he's a Quaker writer, very, very religious man, and part of the anti-slavery movement. And he writes of his own family, which is a loving Quaker family, but which was imbued with the idea of sin, and how that idea enabled him to cope with the slavery that was around him, and of course his own friends were involved in the slave trade and so forth. But somehow to be taught about evil as a child enabled him to be a very strong man, and it was taught within a loving, wonderful family. There's no abuse involved in teaching these things, but I think we perhaps have to get over sugarcoating the world for our children, and we have to get over letting them be abused by these screens which are broadcasting all this nonsense about how you can buy happiness at McDonald's or all these other places. We can't expose them to that and expect them to grow up knowing anything. I think we have to have the courage to control the kinds of inputs which our children get. And I don't think that means that we have to rip the television sets out of the wall. I think that means we have to take control over the programming. As has happened, by the way, in a number of Scandinavian countries. They just don't let children be exposed to that anymore. Well, sounds good to me. Okay, here's another aspect of deep cultural therapy, which occurs to me, is that we would relook at the way we do therapy on addiction and dislocation. At present, we do therapy on addiction by putting it in the tiny box. We say, oh, if somebody's addicted, their brain has been, the switch has been flipped in their brain by the drugs, and they've got to be treated forever in some kind of a recovery program. But that's a tiny, tiny minimization of the addiction problem. It ignores almost everything which addiction is about. It ignores all the other kinds of addiction, for one thing, for the most important thing. And the other kinds of addictions are far more prevalent in total than drug and alcohol addiction. Yeah, if we were going to actually teach addiction, we would deal with people's real addictions. If we were going to do therapy on it, we'd deal with them in effective ways, not by saying that they're out of control or that some switch has been flipped in their brain or some stupidity like that. We would deal with why we do these kinds of addictive things that we do, and we would find ways to work out of it. But also, we would, to go back to the earlier Columbus picture, we don't have to actually flip back there. We would deal with dislocation itself. Really, addiction is not the core problem. Dislocation is the core problem. We will deal with dislocation itself. And how do we deal with that? Well, there's really, ultimately, we deal with that on a systemic level. We deal with that by changing society. We have to. We have to confront modernity for what it is. I mean, modernity is wonderful. We love it, and it gives us microwave ovens and wonderful things like that. But it is also has these toxic side effects. We need to confront modernity for what it is and to change it. Now, at this point, if I'm talking to psychologists, by the way, at this point, the energy all drains out of the room because I've said, well, we've got to change society rather than curing people. But I'm not talking to psychologists, right? I want to talk in terms of, for example, the people who are aware of the anti-slavery movement, of people who are aware of the fact that the world does change in radical ways in short periods of time when it has to, and that this is the task of the moment, and this is the task which we have to do. And finally, I'd like to talk about religion itself, if I could. And you will recognize I'm not qualified. Every one of you is probably more qualified to talk about religion than I am. But we are in a time of religious search and yearning, and that's all around us, right? We see people seeking out every new religion, and I watch the kids playing on video games, and the video games are just packed with religious and mystical symbolism, cheap Hollywood symbolism, I suppose, but religion is really far more powerful than people in my profession have liked to admit. We like to say that, in my profession, we like to say, well, the Enlightenment came along and we discovered that the religious ideas in the Bible could not be derived from Newton's physics, and therefore they're not valid. Well, what we have learned since then is that their validity comes from a totally other place. The validity of religious ideas doesn't come from Newton's physics, or for that matter, from any physics. It comes from somewhere else. And I think we have to look at this problem religiously. Well, what happens if we look at it religiously? What happens? There's you could say that there's something like a religious war at hand. Naomi Klein is very good at saying this. She says that to try to do something about the climate is heresy in terms of the values of the market god. And who is this market god? Well, this market god is of course a spirit of capitalism, not of just any kind of capitalism, but the kind of raw, uncontrolled capitalism that we suffer from, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it. It seems to me there has to be a real confrontation between people of the spirit, religious people, and the followers of the market god, and that it has to be stated in religious terms. It's not something where you win an argument, and hopefully it's not something that you win with swords and clubs. But it is a kind of it seems to me it is a kind of a war. And it seems to me it's a war which is not perhaps even being taken seriously enough by religious people. That there is a market god. There is a conception that the market can solve all our problems. That somehow we leave it to the market and just be as greedy as hell and everything will work out properly. Well, that's a religious point of view. That's about as religious as you get, but it's a point of view which reinforces this vicious cycle which is killing us. And I think that there needs to be some kind of a religiousness in our conflict which goes beyond just an appreciation of the cosmos and the evolution of wonderful species, but a kind of a religious assertion, perhaps of the sort which Jesuits have been capable of in the past, a kind of religious assertion which is much more powerful than what has happened. Well, I will conclude by saying that Paul Hawken has a wonderful book called Blessed Unrest, in which he makes the argument that, as far as he can estimate it, there's probably 1 million groups of environmental groups which are active right now in the world. 1 million. There are all kinds of ideas going on. And I keep meeting the most wonderful people, and I love them. People with new ideas, new kinds of concepts. And I think that it is here that I reach my limits as a scholar. I don't know how to do deep cultural therapy, but I think what behooves me and perhaps you from this point is that we participate in this ferment of blessed unrest, of trying out possibilities. The ways that will do deep cultural therapy perhaps haven't been discovered yet, but they will be discovered in this ferment of people trying to get it right. And that's the future I see. Thank you very much.
Dr. Alexander's agreed to take some questions, so don't go anywhere. There are microphones on both sides of the room, so please feel free to make your way to a microphone, and you can be concise, but feel free. So come on forward, and I'll let you manage the questions as people come.
Hi, Mary.
Bruce, I've just been thinking, I don't know if this works or not. I've been thinking tonight about Rat Park and thinking about you as a young professor and what it must have been like to be at Simon Fraser University during that time, and being able to use that imagination, that creativity, all about the environment and systemic change. And I think about young students today, and I think about the malaise that exists here on universities. The lack of that capacity to give professors, to give students a means by which they can create, that they can make a difference. I think there's a tremendous possibility at universities. And I would like to know, if you were made president of the University of Waterloo, never mind St. Jerome's, what would you do? What would you do? What would be some things that you would do? I mean, I'm serious. Don't laugh. This is incredibly important. What would you do to really make these students feel that they can play a part, that they can have something meaningful like what you created when you created Rat Park? I mean, your whole life has been built on that extraordinary theory that still touches everyone that knows anything about psychology. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Let's really talk about what presidents of universities should do to help students really feel that they have meaning in this world.
That was my wonderful friend Mary Reed who asked that question. Well, and it's a wonderful question. What I see outside of university, because I'm post-university, I'm retired. What I see outside of university is amazing young people who, some of whom have come through university and some of whom are not, but who are wrapped up in these environmental organizations and other political organizations, and they're incredible. What would I do in university? I think I'd rather be president of St. Jerome's. Not that I'm qualified, and never fear. But I would like to, some of the most amazing young people that I've seen have been the religious ones. And I would, as a psychology prof, of course, it's kind of we have this license, we think, that we can say disrespectful things about religion in our lectures, and nobody will pay too much attention. But I've done a lot of that in my life. And I've been educated by the religious young people from the Fraser Valley, where it's a sort of a fundamentalist area. And I would say, you know, sort of crude things about fundamentalist Christians, and someone will come up after class and they say, well, you know, that isn't exactly right what you said. And I have been educated by my students to see the power of spirituality. So what I guess I would rather be president of St. Jerome's, and I think I would like to do what, if I understand from the conversation of earlier this evening, with your president at St. Jerome's, the kind of things which I think you're doing, you know, which is to offer people within a faith kind of a tradition, offer people the opportunity to combine faith and serious academic analysis, and not to leave out the faith part. I was advised by a friend of mine who was a psychologist and a religious person in Vancouver. I asked him what I should say to the psychology students when I gave a lecture up at SFU, and he said, well, tell them not to be wary of the power of love, because it's very serious and something which has to be approached systematically, and that's. I hesitated to use the word because we think of it as the L word in psychology. We rarely say that word. But that's kind of it, isn't it? We have to recombine the sacred and the secular, because we've lost the connection, and I think we can. I think it's happening. I feel it happening, and I'm quite excited about it. So that's what I'm doing. I would rather be president of St. Jerome's. Thank you.
Well, you kind of brought the conversation into the area that I would like to just reflect on a moment with you in terms of the consequences of addiction. And you talked about the fragmentation, that cycle of the society and the self. And you kind of use the words alienation and dislocation of individuals, but what occurred to me when you were talking about that is essentially what you're really pointing to within the ecological crisis. I think you're really pointing to a spiritual malaise, a spiritual problem. So
Yeah.
my interest is to bring it, kind of back into the sphere of theology or spirituality, in a broad sense, and to maybe use that good Jesuit word, since we're here tonight for a Jesuit lecture, the concept of liminality, this alienation of the self that, that could move us into, a deeper sense of the self. And so to see really maybe a positive spin on what's happening in society, like the fragmentation need not be destructive. It could really be pushing individuals to do the very things in relationship to ecology or other crisis situations, because, pushed deep into themselves, their dislocated self discovers a new mode of being. So again, it's the spirituality aspect that I maybe just invite you to reflect on a little bit, even as a psychologist, to see, if you like, the flip side of the challenge being really an opportunity. And working with young people, and I'm a professor here at St. Jerome's, I see the enormous spiritual strength that they have to conquer and to work with these kinds of issues. So for me, the kind of cycle of addiction that you painted, I think there's a problem there, but I also think there's a solution. So I just want to throw that into the pot and see what your take is on that.
Well, there's a solution. Yeah. In my world, there's two kinds of solutions, which is that we try to deal with people individually, and we try to sort of rekindle their sense of meaning, their spirituality, although we don't like to use that word. But we try to rekindle it, and we have limited success. And even though the people who do this work, the people who do the treatment are, they really care, they really work very hard, and they know what they're doing, but they have limited success. So my sense of people being restored to a sense of wholeness, let's say, or spirituality, is that it can never be done on an individual basis. That it's really a structural problem. I am moved by a story that was told to me in the North by native drug counselors, which I would use if you don't mind a little rough language. But they told me that they as drug counselors, they sit on the bank of the river, this great northern river with the white water crashing and thundering down the river, and they see someone out in the white water, and they swim out against the current using all their strength, and they grab this person, and they drag them with the last of their strength back to the shore, and they plop them down on the riverbank, and the person sometimes gets up and walks into the forest and back into life, and sometimes the person stands up, slips on the mud, and they're gone forever. But they save some, and they are warriors. They do what warriors do in this rescue task, and they're very proud of themselves, except that some son of a bitch upstream keeps throwing more and more people in the river every year. And I think we have to deal with the son of a bitch upstream. And I think my little picture here is an attempt to draw a picture of the son of a bitch upstream. And I think we have to go to very large scale global structural kinds of movements, and that's why I think even in terms of religious confrontation between the market god and the other more agreeable gods. I don't know if I've answered your question, have I?
Yeah, no, it's good, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Alexander.
Hello.
My name's Daniel, and Myers-Briggs classifies me as an ENFP, which means my brain is racing right now because I have a lot of ideas racing, and I have made a lot of connections throughout your talk, but don't worry, I will try my best to keep it concise. Really, it just comes down to two observations. First of all, you mentioned St. Augustine and the fact that he was a remarkable figure because he really overcame his addiction to sex and then ended up becoming a bishop and a doctor of the church.
Yeah.
He actually has one of my favorite prayers, which is, "Lord, give me chastity, but not yet." Now, you did mention a title which contained restlessness, right? Right at the end of your talk. Was it the restless?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Blessed Unrest is the title, yeah.
Exactly. So St. Augustine has that prayer as well from his Confessions. "Restless is my heart, O God, until it rests in you." So it's remarkable to see how that's actually very much related to St. Thomas Aquinas's Prima Pars in his Summa Theologiae, when he writes that every human heart desires God. That's what makes us the great paradox or the contradiction, because we're finite beings who can only be satisfied by something infinite. And St. Thomas, in that short passage, writes that when a person takes that desire for God and replaces it with a material being, it's going to become an addiction because they have to consume it infinitely to satisfy themselves. And he writes that's why the glutton turns food and his stomach into his God. With that said, you mentioned the fact that it's important to educate children about sin, and I think it is wise to show how the darkness of this world is affecting the market, how it's making the economy extremely unbalanced. It's making it difficult for young people to even provide for a family that they would like to start. But I would even further say that before focusing on sin, I think it's more important to focus on the fact that we are the products of a loving God and consequently stewards of the goods that we've been entrusted. I think if you go to a powerful CEO who's consumed by greed and you tell him that he's just one of the biggest sinners of the world, well, he'll give you the middle finger, turn away and keep doing what he's doing. But if you tell him that he's loved infinitely, and so much so that he's been entrusted with an incredible power of stewardship, he might actually be inspired to turn his talents into a source of good for the people that he's serving. Luckily, while the economy is falling apart, we are seeing a lot of young entrepreneurs who are opting for social consciousness in their efforts because they're realizing that this corporate greed is getting very tiring. So what I would say with that first point is, yes, we are sin in as much as our nature is wounded, but it's much more important to focus on the good and the love, which will actually inspire us to change. Calling us sinners won't inspire us to change. Calling us loved and beloved children of God is what inspires us to change. And with St. Thomas Aquinas, every sin is matched with a virtue. So a sin is just the unbalanced use of a gift that we already have. And in terms of psychology and faith and reason, I said I do struggle with being concise and getting to the point, but in terms of, I'd love to give a talk one day. Okay, so in terms of faith and reason, I know it's a battle to be fought. 3 sources, I don't know if you've heard them before. Father Benedict Groeschel, who just recently passed away, was a professional psychologist before he became a Franciscan priest. There's a psychiatrist in California. He wrote The Catholic Guide to Depression. He's a fantastic one to look into. There's a third source that I just forgot about, so I'm going to keep it at that. But anyways, thanks for your time.
Well, thank you very much. I do want to say something about the sin thing, because, I mean, it's a very difficult issue. I can tell you that when my wife and I travel, we always travel by train. And that means I interview a lot of people pretty much randomly on the train. And this time, the last couple of times actually, the last few times, I've been asking people about the relationship between addiction and religion and environmentalism, because I want to know what people think. And what I've learned is that, and you may not want to hear this, but a lot of people say, as soon as I say something about religion, they say, oh, I went to Catholic school, don't tell me about that. And by which they mean that they were oppressed by a sense of sin and perhaps a strab. And I think that there is a reality that we have just way overdone the concept of sin in really, really harsh ways. But that happened. And of course we have the residential schools to talk about too. But I think there's a danger of going to the opposite extreme. There's a danger of sheltering children in a way that they become just little Barbie dolls. They don't really have a sense of what's going on in the world, or that they have a role in the world, that they occupy a significant place in it, and that what they do is making a big difference. I think that I'm not really I never use the word sin in talking to my own children, but I think that it's got to be important that we treat our children more realistically than I see children being treated around me, and that I treated my own children. It was just way too sugar-coated. And I therefore I noted when I read this book by John Woolman, which is a wonderful book, written in 1740 or something. But he's just saying that we how important it is for him in seeing the world, that he sees it through those ideas, as well as the supportive, loving kind of relationship that he had with his parents. And I think we have to find the right balance there. And I'm not sure that we haven't gone wrong in both directions in the last century.
I'm very honored to be here tonight speaking to you. My name is Gail. I think you established in the beginning, and I certainly agree, that we see destruction ahead. But how do we break down our addiction to comfort and our feeling of powerlessness against the almighty market God? It seems that we are insensitive to human and environmental pain. I see it, this hurts, and why aren't we naturally using our natural responses to say, this hurts, and fight against it? But it doesn't seem we are doing that. Where is our natural empathy? It seems we vacillate a lot in that area, and I don't know why we aren't gathering more steam. If that's a clear question.
That's a really clear question, and that is the question. That is the critical question, really, that we started with. And the only part of the answer that I know is that sometimes it happens, and that's why I love to study the slavery movement, because slavery had gone on forever, and because the people in England who rose up against slavery had never seen a slave, most of them. The slaves were all in the West Indies, and they never saw one. And yet, something came together. And how it came together, I think we have to say something like, God knows. It came together at that time, and it can come together again. And I think all that we do as bit players in this drama is do our part to try to make it more likely that it'll come together tomorrow than the next day. I think that's what each of us does. But we do it with the knowledge that it can come together. In England, in something like 1800 or 1810, 400,000 people boycotted sugar. Now, the population of England was 12 million. 400,000 people boycotted sugar. Can you imagine boycotting sugar? Do you know how hard that is? Yeah, and they boycotted it because it was produced by slaves. And some people boycotted it for most of their lives. There were, these I'm sure were exceptions. There were people who had never tasted sugar until they got to be 25 or 30 years old. And when the vote finally came and slavery was abolished, then they started eating sugar. That kind of resolve, that kind of iron resolve, it comes from somewhere. And the question you've asked is where did it come? Why did it come then and it's not coming now? Well, I think it's coming now, but what we do is we just try to keep working on it, and in a certain sense we have to wait. In a certain sense we have to say it's not totally in our control.
I agree with you. I think there's a lot happening and we have to wait. We're shooting ourselves in the foot, and I don't know why we don't realize that. And thank you for your answer. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. Thank you very much for your talk tonight. Very quickly, I wanted to know what you think of the movement. You challenged faith institutions and universities and to engage youth and to get engaged. And I wanted to know what you think of the movement to divest from fossil fuels and reinvest in green technology as a political statement, as a public statement by university endowments and faith institutions to sort of hasten the transition to a low-carbon future. So in a lack of political leadership to demonstrate that moral leadership that we've seen in the past, and I wanted to know what you think of that movement.
Oh, well, I mean, that's an easy question. I think that's a wonderful movement. The movement for universities to divest from their investments from fossil fuel. Sure, it's wonderful, and it's happening all over. Is it happening here?
There's a movement on campus here.
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful thing. We can never say that this or that might be the straw that breaks the back of the existing system. But what we can say is that all of those things done by conscientious people, they add up. They have to add up, and it's important for all of us to choose our way to participate in that blessed unrest. So to me, it's part of the blessed unrest, and I'm totally for it.
Yes. I wonder if you could speak to the psychology of denial. I mean, it seems that people all agree with the science of climate change, and yet there is an inability to engage it at a practical level. And it's kind of like we all know smoking's bad for us, and one day we're going to quit. So what is it? What is that, as a psychologist, what is that mechanism of denial, procrastination? Why don't we do what we feel we ought to do?
Well, we deny because we're afraid, right? We're afraid of the reality that we must deny. And I'll tell you two places where I see denial most strongly right now. One is that when I work with parents of drug-addicted children, and parents of drug-addicted children know everything about addiction. They know that addiction is caused by the drug affecting the brain nucleus accumbens of a genetically predisposed person. They know that by heart, and they'll recite that for you, because the alternative is terrifying. The alternative, which is something like this cycle which I've drawn up here, is that my son or daughter had so little in their life that they had to turn to something as banal as a drug addiction or alcohol addiction in order to sustain themselves. That alternative is terrifying. I mean, who of us who are parents? I'm a parent. Is it possible to think that? Because it's so so terrifying. It says so much about what has happened in that child's life in my home. So that's one kind of denial that I see. The other kind of denial that I see is it's these missionaries against climate change, these climate change deniers. Well, what are they denying? I mean, they're denying that there is any climate change, or they're denying that climate change is man-made. But why are they denying that? Well, I have made it a practice to be very good friends with climate change, people who can be called climate change deniers. I don't mean to, to use them arbitrarily, but people who can be called climate change deniers. And I spend a lot of time with them, some of whom are my relatives and some of whom are close friends. And I want to know, how can they possibly deny what it is that that's going on? That all the evidence, but by the reasonable person test, all the evidence shows that we've got a serious climate change problem, but they deny it. What are they denying? And I have concluded, my wife Pat and I have worked on this quite a bit, trying to figure this out. Is that what they're denying is what terrifies them is the idea that in order to stop the climate change, the release of greenhouse gases, which is ultimately causing the climate change, in order to stop that, we really have to change the economic system. That's right. We really do have to change the economic system in dramatic ways to do that, and that is terrifying. And what they're saying, I believe, to me, between the lines, is that to change the economic system, which we have all grown up with and which we know nothing other than, to change that is so terrifying that I deny that it needs to be changed. I deny that this climate change is going on because if I admit to it, then I have to admit to the fact that the world has to change, the economic world has to change, and I can't stand that. The people, in my judgment, the people who get this label of climate change denier are in fact particularly dislocated people for whom the idea that that something as substantial as the economic system could be forced to change is just too terrifying to accept. So that would be my answer. I think the climate change deniers have something in common with the parents, and I think they in turn have something in common with the governments, who simply do not want to. They must deny too, for the same reason. If they don't deny either the reality of addiction or the reality of the environmental crisis, if they don't deny that, then the whole government structure that they live on, is challenged in the most serious and fundamental ways. Well, they must deny it. So I think denial is at the heart of all of this. But this is the kind of thing where I wish I could say there's a mountain of psychological research on this topic, and there isn't. This is where I fault my own profession. I think that we psychologists are, we too live in a cozy little world where we have cozy little assignments that are handy for us, and they enable us to do our work. I'm one of these guys. And if we think outside the box too much, we immediately have to call our own profession into question. That's why, as Christina mentioned, I actually went from spending a lifetime studying addiction to writing a textbook on the history of psychology, because I think that psychology itself is caught in this trap of not exactly denial, exactly putting things into tiny boxes, which must be viewed in much larger contexts if we are to get in the heart of them, because of fear, because of what's at stake, what would come into challenge. Yes, sir.
Yes, you said we needed to change the economic system. Could you tell us what would we change it to? Because what we've seen is that non-market-based economies have not been particularly good with the environment either.
Yeah.
at least in democratic societies, we can put in a regulatory framework. So what would we change it to?
Yeah. Well, I can't give you a short answer to that, but I would like to give you a long answer to that. Naomi Klein is a particular hero of mine, and she's saying, well, this changes everything. This is her most recent book, and she's saying that if we're going to solve the environmental problem, we have to get rid of capitalism. Well, I think that's too simple. I think that what we're going to change it to is going to probably to have many elements of capitalism, because that's all we know. I mean, that is an effective system. I think that capitalism is an institution somewhat like Christianity in this sense, that there's all kinds of varieties of it. And I think that what we have now is a particularly aberrant form of capitalism, which we could call neoliberalism. This is not all of capitalism. This is just a particularly aberrant form invented by Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and Margaret Thatcher, as far as I know. And it doesn't work. So I think we have to get rid of the current form of capitalism. I do not know what is the alternative, but I know what the models are. I mean, we can look at the countries, for example, which are doing something better about the environment and doing something better about their addiction problem, which would be the Scandinavian countries, who are in fact modifying capitalism in a way that makes it a more tractable beast. To some extent, they're reversing the formula. Karl Polanyi's formula is that what went wrong with capitalism was that when capitalism, whereas rather than capitalism formerly was embedded in society, it flipped, and now we have a society which is embedded in capitalism. We have capitalism which is totally dominant. We have the market god. We have made the market into a god. I think the solution would look something like this kind of a reversal where suddenly we can go back to the point where capitalism is a tool of a functioning society rather than being the god which rules our waking up and going to sleep and everything. So, but I'm being vague. I mean, you've asked me a very specific question, what would we change it to? And I would have to say, I can't be more specific than that, but I can say that we can expect an evolution in economics, because economics has been evolving forever, just like religion has been evolving forever. Just like religion is changing, we can expect economics to change in a way which will undo some of the real obvious errors and destructive forces which are built into the current system of neoliberal capitalism. So does that answer your question? Okay.
Okay. Thank you. I really have a lot to think about now with after hearing your talk.
Thank you.
Do you think we can, how do we get to that sense where we feel more a part of the world? A lot of times we spend inside or in front of our screens and stuff, so that we're, I think that's what Thomas Berry's calling us to. How do you think we could do that?
We get to feel more in part of the world by taking charge of it. For example, there's in your neighborhood, like in my neighborhood, there's maybe several groups, maybe a dozen groups, who are working very hard to change the world in a way that makes more sense to them. And we join one of those groups. And then we are a part of the process of change. And at the same time that those groups, if they're the ones that I'm thinking of, are, they're doing really good work. They may indeed change the world in a small way or a big way, But at the same time, they're changing me or you because you're part of them. They need you. They need your help. They don't have enough people. And you'll be instantly part of the world if you join with them, and you'll be doing something good, and you will have a. I'm speaking to myself. This is my way of living in the world, as I belong to such groups, and we don't all have great hopes that we're going to bring about the revolution, but we know what we're doing, and we're trying hard, and we're needed. We're part of that. So that would be my personal answer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yep.
You can have a seat.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Great discussion, please.
We're going to ask Dr. David Selchuk, who's chair of the Department of Religious Studies here at St. Jerome's, to come up and formally thank our speaker on all our behalf.
Okay. Great. You're brilliant. Thank you. Good evening. It's my pleasure to thank on behalf of our assembly here, Dr. Bruce Alexander. This evening talk reminded me of one of my father's favorite jokes, a cartoon of a man sitting on a bar stool, and beside him is his friend who has had so much alcohol that he's passed out and fallen off backwards off the bar stool and now lies on the floor. And the man on the bar stool looks at his friend. He says, "That's what I like about Joe. He always knows when he's had enough." And it seems that we're at that point in the ecological crisis where we consume and we don't know, well, the only way we know we've had enough is when we've fallen off the stool. Dr. Alexander's talk tonight raised so many interesting themes that like our young gentleman here, I find myself spinning in terms of trying to connect them all. One was on sin, and must feel good for a psychologist to address an audience at a Catholic university on that topic, since we have a long history of sometimes using and abusing that very category. But I thought of of St. Paul's letters to the Romans when he said that that sin is that condition where the very thing that I would do is what I do not do, and that very thing that I would not do is exactly what I do. And it seems to me you could not find a more concise definition of addiction than that. I became aware of Dr. Alexander's excellent work by reading his book, The Globalization of Addiction, which, along with his other book, is for sale. I don't think we're pushing drug here by trying to get people to buy your book. But if you're addicted to shopping, just walk past the book table, please. But otherwise, please do pick up a copy of The Globalization of Addiction. It's a wonderful book. And in it, he defines addiction as overwhelming involvement in a substance, a relationship, or a process. And it expands that addiction or that definition of addiction well past that kind of one drug or that one alcoholic drink that drives us to take another one. It's an overwhelming involvement. In other words, it swamps our boat. Unfortunately, in this case, our boat being our life, so that even when it has very pernicious effects on us, we cannot stop doing that one thing. And therefore, addiction, I think, is a wonderful metaphor for where we are at with the ecological crisis. And so I thought about sin and addiction as being connected. And in both cases, you get this sense that for human beings, we always think that sin is a solution to a problem. It's our way of solving a problem. And I've heard that line about addiction, that you cannot understand addiction as a problem until you see addiction as a solution. Then I think Dr. Alexander has shown us what the problem is. He's allowed us to take 2 steps back from the whole story about addiction that we get from mainstream psychology, the whole story about addiction that I personally bought, I had read about, and I was awakened to an alternate way of thinking about it with Dr. Alexander's book, The Globalization of Addiction. And I think Dr. Alexander tonight has invited us to see the global ecological crisis also as something very different than what we thought. It's not that story that we all bought and what we know or what we thought we know about it. It's something quite different, and he's invited us to look at it very differently. Which brings me to drug-addicted rats, which is the slide I wanted to show was about Dr. Bruce Alexander's early experimentation called the rat park experiments. Because everyone knew in the 1960s and 70s that addiction was the brain craving this substance, be it heroin or alcohol or whatever it was. And the rat park experiment, I won't go into the details here, but it does involve heroin-addicted rats. And if that doesn't entice you to look it up, I don't know what will. You can look it up on, you saw the opening slide, ratpark.com. And there is also, I believe on this site, a very clever comic book version outlining the rat park experiments and portraying Dr. Alexander as a superhero, cape and all, who solves a very difficult psychological question. Tonight, let me say on behalf of this audience that in terms of shedding light on the ecological crisis and the spiritual roots of that ecological crisis, you are our hero, and I hope you will all join me in thanking Dr. Alexander.
Thanks, David. So a couple more things before we finish up this evening. First of all, I do want to thank the Jesuits of English Canada for establishing this Ignatian Lecture Fund that supports this lecture every year. And I want to thank again Barbara Peloso, the chair of the board, here with us tonight as representative of the Ignatius Jesuit Center. I want to remind you to sign up in the foyer if you want to receive the latest information about this lecture series and get regular email reminders about our upcoming speakers. And when you sign up, you can also let us know if you would like to hear about other lectures and events that take place at St. Jerome's University during the year. Every year, we are pleased to present to the community a provocative program of speakers. And we're able to provide these lectures to the community at no charge thanks to the generosity of so many partners and supporters. So if you too would like to support the lectures, there are some donation envelopes available in some of the chairs here in Siegfried, as well as in the foyer. And I want to continue to say thank you so much to all who have given so generously to us. If you didn't notice on your way in, then please notice on your way out that there are a number of wonderful, fairly traded products available for sale, some alternatives to what we've been thinking about tonight in the foyer, and that's by our University Social Justice Committee. You will also notice if you go to that same table that at the end of one of those tables, 2 students from our Go Guatemala service learning trip, Esther and Jessica. They're fundraising for their trip, and they are selling, if you've never had them, Rayo Thompson mints for $2 each. Buy them here instead of going to TD Bank and support our students for a little while longer. And again, on your way out, if you didn't stop, I'm going to repeat what David's told you. Wordsworth Books, our wonderful independent bookseller here in town, is with us again. They're in the foyer, and there are books related to this year's lecture series, including Dr. Alexander's book, and he is willing to sign copies. He will be here for a little while longer tonight. Finally, our next lecture is going to take place in the new year on Friday, January 23rd. Dr. Whitney Lachenbauer will be with us to deliver the Wintermeyer Lecture on Religion and Politics, entitled Sometimes Leading, Sometimes Following, Sometimes Side by Side, Catholic and Anglican Missionaries and the Political Evolution of Canada's North. Dr. Lachenbauer is a professor and chair of the Department of History here at St. Jerome's. He researches, writes, and speaks widely on the history of the Canadian North and contemporary circumpolar affairs. So he'll be with us to reconsider the discourse, the common discourse about the role and contributions of Catholic and Anglican missionaries in the shaping of Northern politics and life in the 20th century. So I do hope that you'll come back and join us for that. It'll certainly be a critical reflection on Canada's North, and if you know Dr. Lachenbauer, will be a very energetic reflection on Canada's North as well. And this is certainly in our time a very important part of our struggle for national self-understanding. Fine. So I want to say thank you again so much for coming this evening. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, a safe trip home. And in addition, please have a blessed Christmas with your friends and your family. Until next time, good night.